My name is Zalman Avigdor, and I was born in 1937. I am Jewish and a Holocaust survivor. Honestly, it takes me a lot of courage to say this in front of a camera. Unfortunately, to this day, I am trying to avoid this topic. I was only 4 years old when the war started. What can a child of 4 remember, you might ask? Still, everything that I will describe here are my personal memories. Many wonder how that is possible. I don't really understand it either. I just remember, that's all. One day, before the arrival of the Nazis and their occupation of the city, my mother was able to get a certificate from the city council that allowed us to officially evacuate. It was a crucial document confirming who you are and why you are on the road. Without this certificate, it was simply impossible to leave the city. My mom recalled that the process of getting it was a bureaucratic nightmare and a big problem at that time. I still have this certificate. It is a scrap of paper out of a notebook that gave us the right to flee. And so, on the 19th of August, 1941, my mother, grandmother, grandfather, and me quickly packed up the belongings that we could carry and went to the train station in hope to jump on any train possible that could take us away from the city of Klinci. We just needed to run, no matter where, just run away from the approaching Nazi troops. I don't remember the train station itself, but I do remember how a train passed and did not stop. Everyone on the station was running in panic after the train and screaming, even, help! Jews, help! But it did not stop. Even now, almost 80 years later, I am still terrified when remembering this moment. But we were lucky. In the evening, another train, as we later learned, the last one out of the city, approached, and we were able to board an open cargo wagon. I don't remember much before the war, but I do remember our walks to the forest and our house in Klinci, where we had a room. One of our neighbors was my father's brother Kiva, who was murdered during the war. My mother, my grandparents, and me were the only family members in Belarus and Eastern Russia that got lucky and could escape a few days before the Nazis marched in. The rest of the family, around 70 adults and children, were brutally murdered right there and then, just a few days later. We were traveling in open cargo wagons from city to city, not really knowing our destination and not really having a guarantee that once we find it, we would be allowed to stay there. We drove past many burning forests and villages. We also saw how people were setting train stations on fire, so the approaching enemy would not get hold of it. One time, the train is passing a station on fire along the first track, and my mother was shielding me with her body from the heat and flames. Our train was constantly bombarded by planes. My mother told me that when planes appeared in the sky, the engine driver would stop the train and people scattered in different directions. I remember how my mother and me were lying in yet another field, and while covering me with her body, she was saying, "Look, bombs are flying from the sky." I also remember how we once returned to the train, and shortly after, I heard the most gut-wrenching scream that still haunts me. It was coming from a young woman who was holding her lifeless child in her arms. One time, my grandfather did not return to our train on time and was left behind. No one ever knew when the train would depart and continue the journey east. The conductor must have whistled, but my grandfather either did not hear it or just arrived too late. Tragically, we couldn't just wait for him in hopes to catch another train and had to continue without him. Everybody was in shock and horror, and my mother and grandmother couldn't stop crying. And just imagine, a couple of days later, our train makes a stop at a rather large train station. While we are sitting on the platform and waiting for the ride to continue, a military train passes by on the neighboring track. Its first wagons are filled with cannons, weapons, and military equipment. The following wagons are crowded with Red Army soldiers, and suddenly I can make out the silhouette of an elderly man in a black coat, a big black hat, and a long silver beard. It was my grandfather. I started shouting, "Grandpa, Grandpa!"
Дедушка, дедушка!
My grandfather embraced us, and it's just impossible to describe the joy of this moment. What a miracle! Moreover, my grandfather did not return empty-handed, but came bearing gifts from the soldiers. I remember a half of loaf of some grayish bread and something else. My silly 4-year-old self was delighted and exclaimed, "Grandpa, it would be great if you would get lost more often." I don't quite remember the reaction of my mother and my grandparents, but I assume it was crying or laughing. Next thing I remember is Stalingrad. We were living and sleeping on the streets and were staying for some time at the city's open-air stadium. I remember the empty stands and that it was still warm and sunny. I don't really know how much time we spent in Stalingrad, and who could only imagine what would happen here in a year. Generally speaking, throughout the month that we were on the road, we never have the slightest idea where we would end up. With no clear destination, our travels led us to all possible places. There were official institutions that directed this gigantic stream of refugees to different places, and my mother was running from one place and one massive queue to another to get us permissions to continue traveling. I still can't imagine how my mother, who was always terribly afraid of dealing with official authorities, could handle these bureaucratic hurdles. She had to learn quickly in order to save her parents and her son. Our travels continued for a couple of more months, and finally we arrived in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. We lived there for 5 years and left the city in September or October 1946, 1 year after the war ended. In Samarkand, we and other Jewish refugees lived in so-called kibitkas, which are basically clay huts. There was very little space in these huts, no heating, no water, and no electricity, and we slept on the floor. But we were far from the front line. We were even able to celebrate all Jewish holidays like Passover, Simchas Torah, and Yom Kippur. It was difficult to get food during those years. Bread was the main product, and it could only be obtained with ration stamps. I remember, before the war, my mother once gave me potato latkes with sour cream, and I started to cry and refused to eat them. I remember this incident for the rest of my life, and how I was retelling it to my friends in Samarkand, and they were shocked. How on earth is it possible to refuse food? That's how. My life in Samarkand was relatively free. I was constantly running around the city and exploring. Oftentimes, I was out until very late. I remember how upon returning home, in complete darkness, I was whispering prayers or singing to myself as protection.
KOMEZ ALEF O. Tasche noch einmal und Tage noch einmal. KOMEZ ALEF O.
Residents of different neighborhoods usually hired someone to walk around their district at night with a drum. Streetlights were non-existent, and instead you would hear the sounds of drums in the distance. So, thieves would know that the area is under surveillance. If a crime occurred, the drummer would make a lot of noise in order to alert the crowds. During our stay in Samarkand, I was seriously ill twice, not counting colds or attacks of malaria. Once I had measles, and the other time I got typhus with simultaneous double pneumonia. It was pretty common to get typhus. You only had to drink water from the Arik, which was the main water source. And here you go. I was very sick for a couple of months, and my mother was not sure if I am going to make it. After the crisis was over, I was rather too exhausted or entirely forgot how to speak. According to my mother, instead of speaking, I was croaking like a frog. I also remember how we went for walks. She was carrying me in her arms as I could not walk. My grandfather died on the 7th of November 1942. I remember my grandfather's illness and his death. I can perfectly recall how his arms were constantly and uncontrollably flying into the air. We were not sure about the cause of his death. For some reason, it was assumed the cause was dengue, but it could also have been typhus or cholera. But one thing was definite, that this time I lost him forever. I remember the funeral procession and how his coffin was carried through the city. The cemetery is called Afrasiab, and according to the Uzbeks, it is 3,500 years old, and is some of the oldest cemeteries in the world. I visited the cemetery again in the 90s, and was able to find the spots where my grandparents were laid to rest. By the way, for me, it is crazy to think about that it all happened in the last century. Although it's already 2021, I still can't get my head around the fact that we are living in the 21st century. It seems to me that I still live in the old 20th century, and mentally I probably still am. We left Samarkand in autumn 1946 and moved to Moscow. I perfectly remember our departure. This moment when I was standing in the back of a truck and silently singing to myself a famous song from that time. Farewell, beloved city. We leave tomorrow to the sea, and the blue ribbon will flash from the pier. Farewell, beloved city that saved my life.
With Pripyat brennt a fire.